Today we're talking about the LampCRM API. We'll talk about accessing the documentation and how to interface in LampCRM web apps. Firstly, let's have a look at documentation. So your site name, crm/dbiz/help will give you the list of methods that you can access. We're mostly interested in the employee section, as the web apps are primarily aimed at providing employees with different kinds of interfaces, simplified and customized interfaces. If we go back to our web app that we've been writing, firstly, we will need to download Axios. Axios is the standard for VueJS apps, and this is what we've standardized in, so that's what we will use. So very simply, I'll delete the one that I've previously created, show you the method, Axios, press enter, click the file, and download from JS Deliver. We've got it here already available. That's done. So Axios is fantastic. You can use it directly, but to make things more convenient, we will provide a util. So I've created a util file which imports Axios. Now, when we use Babel to compile the JavaScript files, we use AMD. AMD also provides you with an export functionality. So firstly, import Axios, name it what you will. Axios with a capital A is the standard. This was a test function to make sure things worked before we interfaced with the actual API. So we can get rid of that. But next, I created two functions. So export function get data, we pass in a URL, a request, which will be in the form of JSON data, and success, which is a callback. Firstly, we configure the URL. So we will only pass, to make things easy, we'll only pass the method names really. So for example, we will look at client search. So all you need to pass are client/search, and the rest will be prepended for you. Now we call Axios with the get method, pass in the new URL, which we've just concatenated, the request. Next, we retrieve a promise and catch any errors. Within the promise, we pass in a result. The result contains data which we assign to response. The JSON response is automatically passed for you by Axios. The standard for the LampCRM API is a response status of success. Now, the call may work, but within the call, there may be issues. So we pass in a success to determine whether it has actually succeeded or not. Upon success, we execute the callback, passing in the response. If there is no success, then we raise an alert. You could always show a better error message using the foundation dialog boxes, but for now, an alert will do. Next, we look at post data, which is actually what the client search is. You can see it right here. It's a post. So that is actually the function we'll be using. But it has the same format as the get, which is you pass in a URL, a JSON format request, and a success callback. Similarly, we concatenate a new URL to simplify the calls to post data, and we call post from the Axios library, passing the URL and once again the JSON data, the JSON request. The promise is then returned with a post result. We just log it. Once again, we pass the data to the response. The response contains a response status with the success, at which point we execute the callback. They're both very similar, indeed. So that's our utility. But the key to notice is that we export those two functions. And we'll see in a minute what this means. So if we go to the actual file or view component that we're going to call the LampCRM API in, we can see that we import the utility. So we import star as util from util. Now within util, because we have exported a couple of functions, you will notice that they are then available to us. If we hadn't done that, that is, have an export on the function, it would not be available. But now we can say util.postData. So the export functionality from AMD is very important and allows us to control what is available and what is not. Now, let's have a look at util. Obviously, util, we had to configure it. This is util is a global library, so we configured it in the global config. So util, which is what we've been referring to, once again we require format global jsutil.star.js. Once again, we'll have different versions of util, so we need to make use of the automatic version substitution. We configure a shim this time for util, where we tell it we depend on jQuery and Axios. I'm not 100% sure we need jQuery, but for good measure, I put it there. But the most important one is Axios. So as util imports Axios, we need to make sure that it is loaded before util is. And if it's not, util will refer or potentially refer to a non-existent Axios library, and we will get errors. So the shim here is very important. So we're done in terms of global configuration and coding. So let's concentrate on the page itself. So we have our Lappy component, which we will look further into, but Lappy has to be configured, right, as before. And this component, we'll call it API component, and we'll require format it to make sure once again we use the version substitution. So we're making sure in our configuration that we have the path to our API component and that all the dependencies have been loaded. So for the API component, obviously, we need Vue and util and potentially jQuery. Those dependencies we have been configuring are very obvious most of the time. For example, in Lappy, we import Vue and we import util. So it's obvious that in our configuration, we need to create a shim to ensure that Vue and util are both loaded for the component. So now with our local configuration complete, we can go to the load. Okay. So in the load, I've added the API component, basically making sure everything is configured and loaded before our main file. Our main file, obviously, at this point, also needs to refer to the Vue component by importing it, firstly, and loading it in the components list in the new Vue. That's it for the main file. If we go to the HTML, we will see there is only one change, that is essentially to insert the component API element, which will be replaced with our VueJS code. So let's concentrate on the component now. As you can see, we call view.component. We called it component-API, which is the name we have to refer to here. When we call view.component, component-API is the name it is registered under. That is why in the HTML we can use component-API. Back to the component itself, we have a template. We have written a template, and as you remember, there needs to be a single root element. Here we have a div. Then I put a link, the show clients link, v-on-click, and we call the show clients function, which is listed under methods. There's no parameter passed. Now, some of you may wonder why I assigned this to self. This is assigned to self because this may change context. As we call a particular function, we then have a callback. This may actually refer to something else rather than the component we're trying to work on. So I essentially capture the value of this and assign it to self. From now on, I'm confident that self will not change context and will always refer to the component. So self.clientList is initialized every time we click the button to an empty array, as it is in the data here. There is a more when you do a search with this particular API, it returns a show more value to let you know whether there are more clients or not. So here we're just going to use more, and we assign it false. Next, we call the util, which was right here, and the exported post data function. We want the client search method, and we pass in a JSON request. Right, just to refresh your memory, in the util, post data, URL, the request, and then the callback. So here we have our JSON request, which is required by the API. So if we go back to the documentation I pointed to earlier, you can click on the method, and it will list the parameters. So that's where you can get it from. Here you have a sample. And the actual data it returns. You can expect all the data in JSON. We don't use XML. So here it is. We're not passing any text. We're keeping it simple. Min ID of 0, category of 0. Just to remind you that we're actually referring to the client screen. So it's the same API that is used here. So if I right click, inspect, go to network, choose XHR, right? This is essentially what we're calling CRM DB's API employee client search. So you can also look at this screen to get more information. Here in the headers, you can see the URL, it's a post, and all the details and the request payload. You can also have a look at the different categories. Right, this is what it refers to. So you can always have a look at the existing screens to find out more. If we go back to the API component, after passing our JSON request, we have our callback. The callback passes a response. Now, we want to refer to the more data in the screen. So there's an error here. More, we'll assign to more the show more in the response. Right. So just to demonstrate, if we go back to the screen here, you will see that the response, we'll go preview, has a show more value here, a clients list and a response status. So this is what we're referring to here. We're passing it to the more data on the VueJS component. And then we go through all the clients in the response, pushing the data on the client list. A client, for each, we have an anonymous function which passes the client, and we push the client on the client list. Simple enough. So that's the show clients method. We have a computed value which will then allow us to enable or disable a button. So we refer to the more value here. It's very simple. So that's the different functions, data, just a brief look at the created and mounted events. The life cycle for VueJS components will have a number of events. Most notable are created and mounted, so that's why I usually provide them. But created comes first, and then we have mounted. You will see in the logs that that's the case. So back to the template, we have our link with a VueJS event, v on click, show clients. Then we have a table. You'll see that foundation styles tables quite nicely. We've got some styling here, very basic. Now, we only display the table if the client list is not null. If it's an empty list, we're okay with that, but not if it's null. The reason being that we will be referring to a client list, and referring to null will cause issues. Let me go over the vif directive. Now the vif directive is different to the vshow directive. The vshow directive is essentially a CSS property of display. What is inside will still be processed in terms of VueJS. That's if it's a vshow. But vif will not render the inside at all. The vif will not render the element at all, therefore avoiding any issues with nulls and so forth. So it's very important for you to make this distinction between vif and vshow. Next, we just have a class. This class, though, is not necessary, as the default foundation styling is sufficient. We have the normal T head with TR, nothing special about this. Then we have the T body and the row. Now this is where it becomes interesting. The v-for directive allows you to cycle through an array. In our case, our client list. v-for will give you firstly the element in the array, and secondly the actual index. In our case, we're not using the index, although we could. I can demonstrate. I'll keep it empty. And then just td. We can use our mustache here. Index. Now in our case, it's not that useful, as it is only displays a number, but I have used in other cases to actually refer to the element in the array, such as removal or edits. Next, we use mustaches again to refer to the client by ID, by name, by email. All these fields are available, as you can see here, or within this screen when spying on the API. We close our row, the body, the table. Next, we have a foundation div, row columns, text center to center the button, large button, which is a foundation classes. And here is the disabled, which I was referring to earlier. So the disabled, this is short notation of colon disabled. Colon disabled is a short notation for vbind colon disable, so we can change it. Now let's test this. We're going to HTML, click on our link. So we have all the existing stuff, and we have our table here. So as I said, the styling, the default table styling for foundation is quite nice. So click on show clients, and here we go. If we inspect, refresh again, you'll see that as the existing screen did, we retrieved all the clients. More is disabled, as you saw. Show more is false. Here we have the index that we displayed. We may want to change that and just add one. Checking our page, we can now see that the index has increased by 1. A slight note on some styling. We did some custom styling, but I'd like to actually change that and use foundation classes, so we'll do that. I recommend learning your foundation classes. So here we should be able to go to HTML. So we'll change it to link. Give it a class of button success. So let's have a look. Okay, we have a slide error here, which is due to this. Here we go. Looks slightly different. I've just changed it to large. I just added the large class. So quite similar to before, but you can play around with it. We could essentially go to here and say that button with success. We could say that font, so color white. Save that. Back to the HTML. Here we go. I quite like it, and it's more interactive than before. So highly recommend you use your foundation classes. We can also change this one. So if we go to the Lappy component, look at the search, show clients button, assign the class, button primary. Here we go. Now the show clients button is a bit nicer, I have to say, and works just the same. Now for the footer styling. For our footer, what we might do is a call out. So we go to our main layout, which is where the footer lies. Give it a class of call out secondary. And test that. Here we go. So that's a decent footer. And obviously we need to put that CSS in the global. For the footer, I will give it a bigger margin at the top. Margin top, 20 pixels. Save that. Yes, so CSS is compiled. We've got a new version, so cache busting will not be an issue. Okay, let's check that our CSS was busted. Okay. So page 1, we've got our CSS for our page, but the global CSS main 5. Yes, that is correct. So it's just, it doesn't look like 20 pixels. Footer, call out secondary. Margin top. Right here. Okay, so that is why. So that's easily remedied. And we just need to say important. Back to HTML. Okay, this didn't work. Oh, well, helps. If we save, oh, I didn't notice there's an error here. Invalid CSS. Right here. Right, the error's gone. We should now be fine. That's it. Right, make it a bit more. Let's say 40 pixels. Save that. No errors. Refresh. And I guess it's satisfactory at this point. Show clients. That's it for today and API integration. I hope you enjoyed it.